Um, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be the last technical paper of the session, but I've titled this a little loosely, but the whole idea is to try and bring some of us back to ground zero, if that is at all possible. And I'm going to relate basically to the theme here, which is palm oil. Over the last 2.5 days, a lot has been said about palm oil, the research that has been underscored. But despite the positive messages that you have heard from several researchers, don't forget, there's another body of evidence out there that says different things. So the science has got to be balanced. But while I'm all keen to balance the science, the issues that get to the nerves of people like us is the fact that when you see media outbursts like this, and this has increasingly been very, very common, especially in Europe. Thank God you don't see too much of that in the United States these days. The Americans and the Canadians have become more sane people these days. But in Europe, an advertisement like this, deadly palm oil in your shopping trolley, is not uncommon. But here, deadly palm oil did not refer to your health or my health. It referred to the sustainability issues that are being structured against palm oil. And as a result, what the palm oil industry did, just a little bit background before we get into nutrition, the fact that we volunteered ourselves to sustainable production through an international roundtable, which is called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. There are other certification schemes, like the German International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Schemes. And the food MNCs, the multinational corporations around the world, have pledged to use palm oil, certified sustainable palm oil. But that pledge has been regularly, the timetables have been moved out. And you would see examples like this, Cadbury's, Kit Kat, some of the chocolate products, where palm oil or the palm fat has become a major ingredient. Now, my contention is that we provide a certified sustainable source that goes into this chocolate, but it still does not make this chocolate fully sustainable or eco-friendly or environmental friendly, because you have to take cocoa powder, sugar, etc., that needs to be put in and sustainably sourced, etc. And some of the things we have seen is, a very good example is the production of Nutella in the United States. I would say they are one of the most conscientious producers, food producers, who have always used the best source, and yet they are being subjected to the greatest adversaries in Europe because they use palm oil. And France, this is for those French-speaking friends here, sans huile de palme, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, it says no palm oil. This is not a nutritional claim, and yet EFSA, the European Food Standards Authority, which is such a huge legislative body with the same standing, if you like, as the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, has failed to enforce or remove the labels, and as a result, food companies in Europe are using this as another gimmick to gain greater market share by falsifying labels for the consumer, and the poor consumer cannot differentiate that. So what we are doing, we have to institute legal action, and as I speak to you next week, I have a court hearing in the in France against one of these labeling. So the challenges are beyond. Now, what has triggered these challenges? In fact, if you look carefully and you look at this thing, some of the knowledge workers in the field are actually responsible for this. Or we have a bunch of administrators, health professionals, health administrators spread all over the world. And this is a Codex committee. Now, you always think that Codex Alimentarius, which is an offshoot from the WHO, FAO, has got all their science up there, know exactly what to do. There's a whole bunch of experts coming in from all the nations in the world, and deliberating this. Now, we set this, and I know this at the back of my hand because I was one of the proposals, those sitting here. Codex has got step 1 to step 7, meaning that in order to legislate a codex or bring a codex regulation on stream, it takes an average of 7 years. In the 7 years, we debated the question of cholesterol-free labeling. Now, and you had heard that a plant source is normally stated to be cholesterol-free, but if you do an analysis of the plant source using current methodologies, which are very highly sensitive, you would find traces of cholesterol. Now, so there was a cutoff, but those cutoffs got muddled in the requirement of certain nations and their astute thinking that they want to control saturated fat, total energy, etc. And the protectionist element from producers around the world was always there. The soybean, canola, olive, etc. They all wanted to protect their own commodity, but the thinking process was lost, and as a result, what happened was today, if you adhere to Codex legislations, no oil or fat, plant oil or fat, can be claimed as cholesterol-free. So I think this is a misinformation to the consumer, and you've got to be aware of this. Now, Europe is becoming a hotbed of legislations, and often in a week, I often see something like 2 or 3 very elected representatives to the government who unfortunately often have no scientific backing or principles, would propose a legislation that becomes indoctrinated in the European Parliament or in the individual European nations. A very good example was Denmark. Denmark's saturated fat tax, they call it the sin tax. They went ahead, despite every single protest from their own food industry, other industries around the world. They instituted this, and last year they thought they finally learned the lesson. They could not adhere to it, and they have withdrawn the so-called sin tax. So the thinking process, I would have thought my European counterparts would have a greater thinking process, greater access to R&D, into scientific literature. They simply are lacking that. So to the consumer, reading a food label, as simple as it is for you and me, reading a food label is still a mammoth nightmare. If you talk to your consumer base, you can ask how many of your consumers actually understand or read and understand a food label. You're looking at less than 5% of the population who can make sense out of these very complicated food labels. And as food professionals, we are not doing them any good, and in a way, we may be doing more harm to them than thing. And let me go back to the example that is now been focused on saturated fat, particularly on palm oil. And over the years, we had the privilege of undertaking studies in palm oil, and all these are embedded in the available scientific literature. This kind of studies, the oscillations across continents, in Europe, in Africa, in India, China, are available, and yet this doesn't come to the fore. For example, this was a study that we published in the British Journal of Nutrition, undertaken not in Malaysia, but in Holland. The simple question we asked was, at that time, and this was done in 1990, if we maximally replace palm oil in a European diet, in this case a Dutch diet, what would happen? And we did a huge load of fancy food formulations to fit into the Dutch regular dietary habits, fitted in, and we did a classical clinical intervention. And what you found that if you maximally substituted palm oil in the typical Dutch diet, and at that time, the Dutch were consuming an average of about 38 to 40 energy percent. If you look at the lipoprotein outcomes, absolutely no change between the typical Dutch diet versus a palm oil enhanced diet. But what was already happening, and what we consistently see with palm oil diets, was the fact that the beneficial HDL cholesterol and its different isolates of the HDL were always been significantly and gradually been increased even in a European population. But such a, you don't find, what's bemoaning to me is the fact that this kind of data is never quoted by the Europeans. The literature stares at you, but they don't want to quote this. Let's migrate from Europe to India. Now, India is a very large consumer of palm oil and other oils and fats, but if you look at the overall fat consumption in India, it averages about 15 to about 18 energy%. It may be higher now, but there are stratas of population that would also mimic European sort of fat consumption levels. But here was a study undertaken at the National Institute of Nutrition, one of their premier research institutes. They were also typically worried about what palm oil would do to their population. They did the study, and again, despite extensive examination of the data, they could not find differences palm oil versus their traditional edible oils consumed for the Indian population. From India, we move to China. Now, this I put this, and these are in the literature, because they are major consumers of palm oil. Today, China is the global leader in palm oil consumption. And here was a study that their National Institute of Nutrition in Beijing undertook this study comparing palm, soya, peanut oil. Groundnut oil is very much consumed in China, as well as lard. And you would expect that if you're worried about palm for this population, these black boxes should be in the opposite direction, where the total LDL cholesterol were concerned. They were going down rather than up. Now, in all cases, palm, which is a vegetable fat, was significantly better than their lard, the consumption of lard. Now, in the current scenario, I purposely put this up because here is a twist in our understanding. This lard in China is typical of the saturated fat, animal fat that you would prescribe to lard. But if you go around the world, the composition of lard has changed significantly. And the best example I could say is actually back in Denmark, where the Danish health authorities try to improve the overall health status of the Danish population by making them eat less pork and bacon. But you go to Denmark, what's on your table every day is bacon. Breakfast without bacon is a no-go. And what they did was they intervened in animal husbandry and changed the formulation that they eat the pigs. And today, this lard that you find in Denmark is actually very high in monounsaturated fatty acids. So you got to be careful in the world when you make a legislation that this is maybe typical to China, but this composition for lard is not typically the same as in Denmark. And this is a nightmare that we have to contend with. Now, Africa. This was a study done by Professor Castellet, who a Belgian who used to work in Nigeria, and he was perplexed that the entire Nigerian population at that time, this was I forget the year, but this was a time when Nigeria was a major producer of palm oil, and most of the local consumption of oils and fats in Nigeria was contributed by palm oil. More than 80%, if you read the paper in atherosclerosis, it said that. And when he looked at differences due to palm oil consumption in the Nigerian population, total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, he could not find significant differences. He compared it with typical, what he called as European data, bringing the European levels, and again, white population meaning the European population and the black population in Nigeria, he couldn't report differences, and this paper was published in atherosclerosis. So these are hidden indicators of where the overall fitting of the current understanding of saturated fat hypothesis can take place. Dr. Kosla talked about what trans does and what are things that have been done. And today, labeling in most worlds, most advanced nations, developed nations, focuses on this. This is very common. They do add a component to saturated fat and trans fatty acids. Why? The thing is that we want to remove, there's a whole science behind the adventure or the need to remove trans from the global food chain. And that is moving very rapidly, but you would find significant resistance to its complete removal from the food industry because they need to find substitute solutions. Now, one of the substitute solutions that appeared to be working was palm oil because I always say to my food industry friends, you tell me what fraction you need, and I take palm oil like a Microsoft Word, this thing. I will cut and paste it for you to your requirements. And that's not a boast. That's what we do in our pilot plants. We fit that to your requirements. So there are various fractions. And as a result, these are studies from Mozafarian, Harvard School. It shows that palm oil can be a safe substitute for trans fatty acids. And this has been tested in Australia, for example. Very recently, Australia tried to legislate against palm, the consumption of palm, and it failed. But even in their own environment, one of their most prominent nutritionists have done studies in CSIRO. Actually, this gentleman was Dr. Mahinder's ex-boss. I used to work with him for a while as well, or in his lab. And he showed that there's no adversity associated with palm in a solid fat formulation, but voila, lipoprotein A, LP(a), is significantly increased by trans versus a palm oil diet. In fact, if you trace back the literature, in 1990, while we were working in Holland, Dr. Honstra and I were the first people to report that the lipoproteins can be modulated by a dietary fat rather than through a genetic control. And that's in the doctrination. And these are gems that have been coming out. And I'm going to blame Tom Clandon here for not knocking this harder on me. Now, at a time when we were looking at saturated fat versus trans and how to differentiate to the world or to justify to the world why saturates are different from trans, he came up with this. We did a deuterium label intervention trial in humans, and this was done, and then he helped analyze this. You can see that between palm and trans, there was expected significant differences. But what was very telling was that the mechanism that was involved that was self-explanatory. But between the two of us, we probably forgot to take this to the next step, and this is a price we are paying because today what is happening in Europe, again, is that the so-called uninformed legislators, that means the elected parliamentarians, are saying that the saturates are worse than trans, or palm is worse than trans, but this is the evidence. There is mechanistic evidence that suggests that the way the body physiologically handles cholesterol synthesis can be different between a saturated fat and a trans. And it's all science. It's not hearsay. And there's, again, a significant body of evidence because when you talk to the world today, we say that olive oil is the gold standard. Now, why olive oil? Epidemiological data, especially out of the Mediterranean population, has consistently shown that people consuming an olive oil diet or the Mediterranean lifestyle have lower incidence of mortality from heart diseases than their North European cousins. And as a result, olive oil has got the gold labeling or the platinum labeling that it has today. Now, one question as a nutritionist and somebody involved in fatty acid metabolism, I've asked myself the question, olive oil has got 70% oleic acid, monounsaturated oleic acid. I look at our palmolene, it can have 50 to 60% oleic acid, depending on the way we prepare the liquid fraction of oil. The question I always pose to fellow nutritionists and lipid experts is, what is the optimum level of oleic acid that we need for physiological maximization, if you like. Nobody can answer that. And in a way to answer that, we said we'll go and do direct comparisons. This was olive, and actually Dr. Tony is here. He did this study. This is again olive. This is palm oil versus canola, rapeseed, the monounsaturated oils. We did this expecting the worst, but there were no significant differences in lipoprotein metabolism from this. And yet, I know of a particular study out of CSIRO Australia where it says a very high oleic acid diet can be pro-arrhythmic. This is Peter McClellan's study, and somehow it's got rubbished and put in the back burner, if you like. But these are the things. Now, there's a lot of debate in Europe, especially now. The dairy fat, 12 or 14 and versus diets rich in palmitic and stearic acid. We've extracted the data, and there's more to be done. This was something that we did some time ago. And if you try to differentiate the impact of lauric and myristic acid versus palmitic or stearic acid, there is a difference. That means in the fat world, we know, at least the experts working this, we know that we actually compartmentalize fat responses in terms of carbon chain length. And there is definitely a distinction between 12O and 14O versus 16O and 18O. But yet, what we see is that an override where virgin coconut oil has got the virginity label of the oils and fats, and the science behind the effect of lauric plus myristic acid is totally hidden, because in all the saturated fat, if you believe saturated fats trigger cholesterol increases, the single saturated fat that actually consistently triggers cholesterol increases are myristic acid, 14O. Now, unfortunately, in nature, you look at dairy fats, you look at coconut oil, you look at palm kernel oil. 12O and 14O always coexist. You cannot differentiate between 12O and 14O, and herein lies the problem. So there is another learning that we need to do. Now, in a real-world situation, the opportunity is to combine the benefits of not just one oil, many oils. The more you, and today, blending is becoming a more acceptable terminology, and this has been done. And I quote back because I think that the greatest example, or the best example that I can quote comes from our own work, which has now become a mainstay of a product in the United States. And this was a research actually conceived here. I conceived it with Professor Hayes. We undertook the clinical trial, and the end solution was this. It was money back in the kitty for the science that we put in. So that's an example. Now, the US is now going through what we call as the dietary guidelines for 2015. And the US food industry themselves sometimes are no angel, because soybean, no, this is a economic consideration as well. We've taken, because of hydrogenated fat, the standard high linoleic soybean oil has been taken out of potential circulation for the food industry. So it needs to come back. And the way they're doing it is the US food industry is going through a GMO cycle, creating high oleic varieties, high stearic acid varieties. There's a lot of hype about high stearic fats because stearic acid is said to be neutral. It is, in studies, if you look at it, there is evidence to show that stearic acid is neutral to cholesterol, total and LDL, and to lipoprotein cholesterol metabolism. I was intrigued, and I did something crazy, which the Americans have never forgiven us. We undertook this study, all right? Because at that time, ADM, Arthur Daniel and Midlands undertook this study, this product, which actually, when President Bush was the president of the USA, they got the Presidential Award for this formulation. which is a fully hydrogenated interacidified stearic-rich fat they wanted to put in this. And we said, hey, there's something wrong with that. I don't believe it, and I put this study out. And what it did was it created a nightmare for a lot of people because we purposely publish it open access. And if you look at the this thing, this has got a download of 46,000 plus. Why? We prescribed to the notion that stearic acid-rich fats were actually cholesterol neutral, but here was a case where you compared with the palmitic acid-rich diet, there was no difference. But what was worrisome and why this paper got such a high hit was that when we looked at plasma glucose and insulin, read the paper, there was a significant increase in plasma glucose and insulin due to the high stearic acid-rich diet versus a palmitic or even a trans-rich diet. Now, in the current era, when an epidemic or an endemic or onslaught of diabetes is accepted, you do not want to change your food base to something that could trigger higher glycemic load on the population. So we simply, it was science, we put a question mark onto it, and I know that currently a number of independent laboratories are re-examining this approach. And now, fatty acids can be very complicated. They remain very complicated because it's often the way you analyze the data. And I just dumped this. This was something that was done in a review, a very extensive review. And it can, if you look at the data very critically, it shows that at certain levels of consumption, even your most feared saturated fat can be cholesterol neutral. And this concept seems to be associated with the fact that it is energy dense, fat energy dense. It's a very difficult analysis because if you look at the studies that were critically done in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, when America was consuming these levels and the Europeans were consuming this level, 37% energy as fat calories. Yes, palmitic acid was, and stearic acid possibly, and lauric and myricic acids were cholesterol enhancing. But today we become more sane with fat consumption. Most populations are moving into this, and it's actually showing an energy balance and a lowering of cholesterol metabolism. And it makes a lot of sense, at least it makes some sense to me, but how to project this into potential labeling it continues to be a big challenge, right? And bottom line is, things get more complicated. We presented some data yesterday. It is no more simply looking at total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, etc. Our methodologies are becoming more, more empowering. We are now looking into more sophisticated indicators for risk assessment. And again, for palm oil, we are doing this. But what we are seeing is that in a population such as Malaysia, where this is, we've been tracking people who have been consuming palm oil consistently day in and day out for 20 years. What we are looking at is, if you look at this is the biggest LDL trigger or risk factor, we are not seeing a difference. Now, this is very preliminary data. We will confirm. We need, I'm going to spike up the population in this study group to at least 500 to get the numbers right, and this is where we are looking at. So, ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up the situation, I think the fat story remains as complicated as a time when Ansel Keys suggested the Keys-Hexted equation and tried to get at his. But bottom line is that if you have your thinking kept straight, you don't have to sort of take any of these natural oils or fat. You don't have to be an advocate or an opponent of this. Within this paradox of different fatty acid compositions, we say that there are about 17 different oils and fats available in the human global supply. It makes a good formulator to take the best out of it, combine them in one or more proportions, and you would probably get the best ideal fat that we are all thinking and yet we have not come up with. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.